story about that?
Okay. Well, you and I, we were talking yesterday, right, about things, and I came up with this story, and I said, I don't even know if I've ever told you this story. It's kind of a Christmas story. It turns out to be a Christmas story, but it starts off with two things that could possibly have been pretty tragic. And years ago, back in the 70s, maybe a little before late 60s, out in Grossmore, where I'm from, my dad was part of a rescue of a young girl who went into labor in a place called Trout River. Trout River is on the outside of Grossmore National Park, and to get to Trout River, where I grew up in Woody Point, you drive through an area called the Gulch with the tablelands. It's gorgeous in the back. It's a beautiful place. But in the winter, when the wind blows the right way, it can be absolutely treacherous. It can be beautiful, sunny on both sides, but in that mountain gorge, it can be treacherous. And this young woman had the misfortune in the winter to go into labor. And at the time there was a nurse stationed out there, and they decided to put her into a sleigh and a horse. Now this was in the 70s, there were cars and there were highways, but not that night to get to Trout River. So they put her in a sleigh drawn by a horse and wrapped her up in blankets, and the nurse and two men from the little town of Trout River decided to go through the gulch to get to the other side to Woody Point, where they could take her to Corner Brook to the hospital to have her baby. On the way through the gulch, which probably takes about 15-20 minutes to drive at Haybeck, on the way through, the horse died, and they had to pull the sleigh by hand. My father and my two uncles, actually, they worked in a business, a transport business garage, and ran a taxi bus service. They were coming the other way to meet them. And so they had to hike up through the gorge and meet people on this highway that didn't exist because of the whiteout, and get her out. They managed to get her out to Woody Point, get her in a vehicle, and take her to the hospital. My dad said that she was absolutely blue, her lips, her fingers. And as my uncles drove, because by that time the storm had come across, my uncle had one head out the window on one side and the other on the other, and my dad got down on the floor and held this young woman to keep her warm until they got her to the hospital. She did survive, as did the baby. The nurse was there with them as well, and she ended up having some injuries. She lost some toes and some fingers and whatever. Years later, I took a job with Western Health, and I was working in that clinic out in Trout River, and the people are really warm and friendly. My dad is quite well known to them, and whenever anybody asked who this young girl was that was working at the clinic, I would say, oh, I'm Bax Parsons' daughter. And that was always good. Everybody knew who I was then. And so this woman came in with her, I guess, 20-year-old daughter at the time, and she said, same question, who you are. And I said, my dad, everybody knows my dad is Bax Parsons. She said, your father saved my life. And I said, really? And she told me that story, which I had forgotten about. And I knew who she was after, because she did have like fingers missing from the frostbite that she had gotten that night. But I had met her and her now young adult daughter, and as they say, she taught the world to my dad. And Janetta, her name was, would always pass the time to me and that whenever she saw me. It was a really nice story, and it could have been a lot worse. But years later, my sister's father-in-law was puttering around in his workshop in Corner Brook early one morning, and I always listened to CBC radio, and I happened to bump into him a few days later, and he said, you know what I heard the other morning on the radio? He said, it was like early, 5:30 in the morning. He said, I heard your father. And I said, my dad? He said, yeah, I heard your dad on the radio. he said, talking about this rescue. And I said, oh my God, I've forgotten about that. So, you know, you file that away. But there was one big thing that it was different. A few years before that, my dad got cancer. And he was the kind of man who he would always be singing. He took his guitar everywhere. He loved to tell jokes. He collected jokes. He wrote them down. He talked all the time. He laughed. He was a very animated person. And he loved people. And he just loved hearing stories and telling the stories. It was the highlight of his life. And he ended up with throat cancer. That means the cancer had attacked his larynx, which is his voice box. It stayed there, which was really fortunate, but the unfortunate part was that they had to remove his larynx, which meant that he couldn't speak anymore. So fast forwarding now to those years later, when his friend Jack Haynes told me about the story on the radio, I thought, CBC radio, I can get a copy of that, because CBC does that. There's public transcripts. You can request them. You can write to the station. And, you know, your Uncle Lawrence had such a long career with CBC in Toronto and stuff. And, you know, I know a lot about CBC. I love CBC radio and CBC TV. And so at the time, I happened to bump into a gentleman named Michael Coyne. And Mike used to host a morning show here in Gander. And Mike I just said, hey Mike, you know, I'm looking to get a transcript of a show, because I knew exactly when it was on and all that, and I told Mike the circumstance and stuff, and he said, oh yeah, that's no problem. He said, but he said, that's great, I could get that for you. He said, but, he said, right now we're locked out, we're in a labor dispute. CBC was on strike, so all was here was like a couple managers running everything, and it was a really long labor dispute. Anyways, a few weeks later, it happened to be like just before Christmas, like the 23rd of December, I think, really close to Christmas. I got a phone call at my work from Mike, and he said, I'm going to be out later. He said, but I've got something for you in my mailbox, because he knew that where Becca, remember, you went to Alma's all the time. Alma and Bill looked after you. They lived on the same street. So when I went to pick you up, you know, we kind of grabbed the tape. And that night, my sister was driving through to go to Grossmorton to be with my mom and dad for Christmas. And I didn't tell my two sisters who were here that I had it. And that night we listened to it at my sister's house. And it was amazing to hear him speak and to hear how he said words, to hear. I've forgotten how soft his voice was. What a nice voice he had, because remember he had that, when he couldn't speak, he had that electrolarynx, which made him sound like a robot. And you kind of forget what, you don't get the emotion, you don't get questions sound the same as statements. It was different, wasn't it? But it worked because he got to speak. But hearing that voice, it was amazing. So I had this idea that I always tried to do something for Christmas that caught people off guard, that was different or unique, and this would fit that perfectly. So I took the cassette tape and I wrapped it up, and I wrote, "To Little Baxter Parsons, love Santa Claus." And I gave it to my sister Christine, who was going there, and she had brought it to their house. And on Christmas morning, under the Open Me First instruction, was the tape. So Christine put it in to play, and my mother was in the kitchen, as she often was, and still is sometimes, cooking and baking, and she just stopped, and my dad stopped, and everybody cried, because we were on the telephone listening as she did this. And so, you know, it turned into a great Christmas miracle, because it allowed not only us to hear him again and have it now, like despite like people having videotapes and stuff and stuff, now you get voices more because we all have that ability in our hand. But then, you know, it was someone's wedding, you videotape that, or someone's graduation. But to hear him speak on that interview that he did for CBC about the rescue mission for such a long period of time, uninterrupted, was amazing. And to have that voice that used to sing and laugh and tell jokes and hear that again was priceless. It was priceless. So that brought Dad back to all of us, and even it brought it back to him about, you know, that having that little happy accident happen from Michael Coyne, who took the time to go and do this despite being out on strike, and to go and do this because he wanted to do it because of the story I told him, and to get it to me as before Christmas so that I could give it to my dad. That was amazing. It was the best. Hey, Jeff. Keep going?
Yeah.
Just passed up.
I can edit it.